Their name appears somewhere it has no reason to appear, a conversation nearby, a song lyric, a random notification, and something inside you goes still before your mind even catches up to why. Maybe it's a memory that surfaces without warning, uninvited, vivid, arriving in the middle of an ordinary afternoon as if summoned from somewhere you didn't consciously visit. Or maybe it's a coincidence that lines up too precisely to wave away casually. Timing that feels less like chance and more like something quietly insisting on being noticed. You feel the pull of it immediately, that particular charge that says pay attention, this matters right now. This isn't random noise, and it isn't your mind manufacturing meaning out of nothing to entertain itself. This is the exact kind of moment Carl Jung spent much of his life studying closely, moments that refuse to be filed away as ordinary coincidence, moments that carry a weight rational explanation doesn't fully account for. What you're calling urgency, that unmistakable sense that this needs your attention now, isn't random either. It's specific. It's your own psyche attempting to communicate something, using a language far older and far less literal than words, a language built from timing, symbol, and charged repetition instead of plain sentences. Most people either dismiss this feeling entirely, forcing themselves back into logic before they've actually understood what just happened, or they get swept up in it completely, mistaking urgency for certainty about what it means. Neither response actually explains what's occurring beneath the surface. So before deciding whether to trust this feeling or talk yourself out of it, there's a more important question worth asking first, one Jung's own work offers a genuine answer to. Why would your mind flag this particular moment, this specific person, as urgent at all? You've probably already tried talking yourself out of it, telling yourself it's just a coincidence, that names repeat, that memories surface for no particular reason, that you're reading significance into something that means nothing at all. That's the reasonable thing to do, the responsible thing, the thing that keeps you from feeling foolish. And yet, despite every rational argument you've offered yourself, the feeling returns anyway, quietly insistent, refusing to be reasoned into nothing no matter how firmly you try to dismiss it. There's a particular kind of vulnerability in admitting that, in acknowledging you've been rattled by something as small as a name or a memory or a strange alignment of timing, because it can feel embarrassing, almost childish, to take a coincidence that seriously. You worry what it says about you, that you're grasping, that you're desperate, that you're seeing meaning where a more grounded person would simply shrug and move on. But here's what's worth understanding before going any further. This response isn't delusion, and it isn't a sign of fragility. When something registers this persistently, when logic fails to dissolve it no matter how many times you attempt the override, that persistence itself is information. Your unconscious mind doesn't flag things randomly. It flags what it has already determined to be significant, often long before your conscious mind has caught up enough to explain why. So the fact that you can't simply reason this feeling away isn't proof that you're being irrational. It's proof that something underneath your conscious awareness has already decided this matters, and that decision doesn't dissolve just because your logical mind objects to it. This is exactly the kind of experience Carl Jung took seriously, not as mystical fantasy, but as a genuine psychological phenomenon worth understanding on its own terms. And once you see what he actually observed about moments like this, the persistence you've been fighting starts to make a great deal more sense. Carl Jung gave this exact experience a name: synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, events connected not by ordinary cause and effect, but by significance to the person actually experiencing them. Two things happen close together: a thought and an event, a memory and a message, a name and its sudden appearance, without one causing the other in any traditional sense. And yet the connection feels undeniably meaningful anyway. Jung didn't treat this as mystical nonsense or wishful thinking dressed up in academic language. He treated it as a genuine psychological phenomenon, one he encountered repeatedly in his clinical work, occurring specifically when someone's unconscious mind and outer reality seem to align around material that is emotionally charged and still unresolved. This alignment isn't random, and it isn't proof of fate orchestrating anything on your behalf. It tends to surface precisely when something inside you hasn't been fully processed, understood, or laid to rest, an emotional loop still quietly running in the background, waiting for enough attention to finally close it. This is where the urgency itself becomes worth examining more closely. That specific feeling, the I have to know, I have to reach out, I have to understand this now sensation, is often less about the external world handing you a guarantee, and more about your own unconscious signaling that something remains unfinished, something still requires acknowledgement before it can settle. Synchronicity, in this sense, isn't a promise about outcome. It's a spotlight, illuminating exactly where your own unresolved emotional material still lives, asking to be seen rather than asking you to predict the future. Understanding this reframes everything about how to hold a moment like this, not chasing certainty about what it means for someone else, but getting curious about what it might be revealing about you. So if this urgency is genuinely pointing toward unfinished business, the question becomes far more specific and far more useful than simply wondering what it means. What exactly is that unfinished business, and where inside you is it actually pointing? The first thing worth understanding is how the psyche actually treats relationships that never reached a clean, understood ending. It doesn't simply file them away as finished once contact stops or circumstances change. Instead, it tends to keep them quietly open, replaying fragments through memory, surfacing them in dreams, triggering them unexpectedly through small associative details, a song, a scent, a passing resemblance, until something about that emotional loop finally feels complete enough to close. This is why a sudden, intense pull toward a specific person is so often less about their present feelings toward you, something you have no real access to, and more about an internal need still living inside you, a need for closure, for understanding, for acknowledgement that was never fully reached the first time around. Think of it like a browser tab left open somewhere in the background of your mind, one you forgot you even had running, quietly consuming attention and energy without your full awareness, until something brings it back into focus and you suddenly remember it was there the entire time. That tab doesn't close itself simply because time has passed. It stays open until it's actually addressed, examined, or consciously resolved in some way. Psychologists have observed something similar in a well-documented phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect. The tendency for unfinished tasks, unresolved situations, or incomplete emotional experiences to occupy far more mental space than things that reached a clear, settled conclusion. An unresolved relationship functions exactly like an unfinished task in this sense, quietly demanding cognitive and emotional attention precisely because it was never allowed to fully resolve. This is also why your unconscious mind may unconsciously rehearse this relationship, replaying certain moments, certain unanswered questions, certain unspoken things, almost as if searching for the ending it never got to construct the first time. Here is why this distinction actually matters. Understanding that this urgency may be pointing inward, toward your own unfinished processing, rather than automatically assuming it reflects something happening on the other person's end, in perfect synchronized timing with your own experience. This isn't meant to diminish what you're feeling. It's meant to locate it accurately, because the loop demanding closure might belong entirely to you, something worth honoring and understanding in its own right, regardless of what the other person is or isn't experiencing simultaneously. And yet, this explanation alone doesn't account for everything, because sometimes what feels like a signal isn't only about unfinished business living inside you. It also touches something that once existed genuinely between two people, and that possibility deserves careful, honest consideration too. If there's a second layer worth considering honestly, without stretching it into something it isn't. Two people who once shared real emotional significance don't simply stop being connected to shared context the moment distance enters the picture, and that shared context can create something that feels eerily synchronized, without requiring any explanation involving literal telepathy or mystical transmission between minds. Consider what actually gets built inside a meaningful relationship, a shared timeline, overlapping memories, associative triggers that belong to both people equally, certain months, certain songs, certain kinds of weather or anniversaries that quietly carry emotional weight for both of you, whether either person consciously tracks that weight or not. This shared architecture means it's entirely plausible, psychologically speaking, for both people to be independently triggered by the same associative cues around similar times, not because one caused the other to think of them in some mysterious real-time link, but because you're both running parallel emotional calendars built from the same lived history. A certain time of year, a certain kind of transition, a certain emotional atmosphere. These can activate memory and longing in both people simultaneously simply because you both have the same reference points buried in similar places. This makes what feels mystical actually far more explainable than it first appears, while still leaving real room for why it feels meaningful anyway, because meaning doesn't require magic to be genuine. It's worth being honest here too. This isn't a guarantee that they are thinking of you at this exact moment, and it would be irresponsible to promise you that certainty. What it does offer is a grounded explanation for why the timing sometimes feels so eerily aligned. Shared emotional resonance built over real history, surfacing through associative memory rather than coincidence alone, rather than nothing at all. Jung's understanding of synchronicity was never really about proving causation between two separate minds. It was about meaning-making, about how deeply significant experiences create connections that feel real and important, regardless of whether they can be proven through conventional cause and effect. So resonance like this helps explain why a moment might genuinely carry meaning, connected to something once real between two people. But it doesn't yet explain something else worth understanding. Why this feeling so often arrives wrapped in urgency, frantic and immediate, rather than settling in as calm, quiet knowing instead. This is the piece that deserves the most careful attention, because urgency itself, that frantic, immediate, must-act-now quality, isn't the same thing as intuition, even though the two often get mistaken for one another in the moment. Calm curiosity, a quiet sense of wanting to understand something, feels entirely different in the body than panic does, and it's worth learning to tell them apart before deciding how to respond to either one. Urgency specifically tends to arise when the unconscious perceives a closing window, a fear that if this isn't acted on immediately, the opportunity for resolution, understanding, or connection will disappear entirely, permanently, without a second chance. That fear can feel enormous in the moment, convincing, undeniable, but its size doesn't automatically make it accurate. This is where discernment becomes essential, learning to distinguish a true intuitive signal from anxiety-driven urgency that has simply borrowed intuition's voice to make itself heard more loudly. Genuine intuition tends to feel steady, even when it's insistent, a clear pull that remains fairly consistent whether you act on it today or next week. Anxious urgency feels different, frantic, time-pressured, insisting that everything will fall apart if you don't move right this second, and that specific quality, the panic, the countdown sensation, often has less to do with clear knowing and more to do with fear of loss activating your attachment system rather than your intuition. Here's a distinction worth holding on to carefully. There's a real difference between I feel pulled to reach out, a settled, grounded sense that this matters and deserves attention, and I feel panic that I must reach out immediately or lose everything forever, a much more frantic, anxiety-soaked version of the same impulse. The first is intuition, quiet but clear. The second is often attachment anxiety, borrowing intuition's language to justify urgency that isn't actually about accurate perception at all, but about fear trying to force resolution before it feels unbearable to keep waiting. Recognizing which one you're experiencing changes everything about how to respond, not by ignoring the feeling entirely, but by understanding what's actually driving it before letting it dictate immediate action. And once you can see all three of these layers together, unfinished internal business, genuine relational resonance, and the distortion urgency sometimes creates, there's a deeper truth connecting all of them that changes how you're able to hold this entire experience, one that has less to do with what this moment means about them, and far more to do with what it's actually asking of you. Here is the truth waiting beneath everything we've walked through, and it deserves to be said plainly. Whether this urgency stems from your own unfinished internal business, genuine relational resonance built from real shared history, or an anxious echo woven through both of those things at once, it is real information, worth honoring, not something to dismiss as foolish or embarrassing simply because you can't prove exactly where it originated. You weren't imagining significance where none existed. Something inside you registered this as meaningful, and that registration deserves to be taken seriously, regardless of which explanation turns out to be the most accurate one. Here's what matters just as much. Trusting this intuitive pull doesn't require certainty about what will happen if you act on it. You don't need a guaranteed outcome to justify honoring what you're feeling. Certainty was never the price of admission for taking your own inner experience seriously. This is the realization worth carrying forward. The message you feel waiting isn't necessarily a message from someone else at all. It may be a message from your own unconscious, patiently, insistently asking to be heard, understood, or gently resolved, regardless of whether the other person ever becomes part of that resolution. Sometimes the person who needed to receive this signal was never them. It was you, all along, finally paying attention to something inside yourself that had been waiting quite a while to be acknowledged. This reframes the entire experience in a way that actually offers relief rather than more pressure, because you no longer need external confirmation to validate what you're sensing internally. You can honor this urgency exactly as it is, real, meaningful, worth paying attention to, without needing a specific outcome to prove it mattered. And that peace, the ability to hold something significant without needing it resolved externally to feel legitimate, is worth protecting carefully, regardless of what you ultimately decide to do with what you're feeling, because your steadiness was never meant to depend on how someone else responds to a signal that, in many ways, may have been asking you to listen far more than it was asking you to reach out. Now that this understanding belongs to you, it's worth being clear about what it's actually asking and what it isn't. Honoring an intuitive pull doesn't mean acting on it impulsively, and it certainly doesn't require abandoning your own dignity in pursuit of resolution, chasing an answer so urgently that you lose sight of your own steadiness in the process. You can fully acknowledge this signal as real and meaningful, and still take time to decide, calmly, what you actually want to do with it. Reaching out is a valid choice. Choosing not to is equally valid. What matters far more than which option you pick is the place you're making that decision from. A grounded place rather than a frantic one, clarity rather than panic dictating your next move. There's an important difference between healthy acknowledgement of a feeling and letting that feeling override your judgment entirely. Rushing into unconsidered action simply because urgency demanded immediate relief from its own discomfort. You are allowed to sit with this signal, examine it honestly, and choose your response deliberately, on your own timeline, rather than the timeline panic tries to impose on you. This is where differentiation matters again, staying connected to what you're feeling internally while still remaining a separate, intact self, capable of making decisions based on reflection rather than reactivity. Discernment here means recognizing the difference between insight, which can wait and remain just as true tomorrow, and impulsivity, which insists everything must happen right now or be lost forever. It's also worth separating the validity of this signal from any specific expectation about how the other person might respond if you do reach out. The signal being real doesn't guarantee a particular reaction from them, and your worth was never meant to hinge on whether their response matches what you hope to receive. You can honor what you're sensing internally while still protecting yourself from placing your entire sense of peace on the outcome of someone else's reply. That protection isn't distrust of your own intuition. It's simply self-respect, making sure that however you choose to act, you remain someone whose steadiness doesn't depend on the response you get back. There is something worth naming clearly, especially now, after everything this understanding has revealed. Your sensitivity to these signals, the way you notice what most people would simply let pass by unexamined, was never irrationality dressed up as intuition. It was depth, a mind and psyche attuned enough to register significance in moments most people move through without a second thought. That attunement is not something to apologize for or explain away. It's something to trust, carefully, wisely, but genuinely trust nonetheless. Think about who this understanding actually makes you moving forward. Someone who can tell the difference between anxious urgency and genuine intuitive signal will move through moments like this with steadiness instead of panic, able to honor what she feels without needing an immediate outcome to validate that feeling is real. You won't need someone else's response to confirm that what you sensed mattered, because you'll already know, quietly and clearly, that it did, regardless of how the situation eventually unfolds. This kind of clarity tends to arrive only after paying close, honest attention, and choosing to understand your own inner world instead of dismissing it every time logic tried to argue it away. That's not a small transformation. That's how someone grows into a steadier, more grounded relationship with her own intuition, trusting it without needing it to be perfect, without needing every signal to lead somewhere provable or certain. And maybe the quietest, most important part of this is simply this. You can carry this awareness gently now, whatever you eventually decide to do with it, reaching out or staying still, without either choice threatening the steadiness you've built and finally trusting yourself. Your peace was never meant to depend on someone else's timing, their readiness, or their response. It was always meant to live inside you, patient, grounded, and quietly yours. If any part of this found you at the right moment, let it settle a little longer, not as something urgent to resolve tonight, but as a quiet clarity you now simply carry forward, exactly as it is.